We hope that Nigel and the leadership of Reform will be responsive to good ideas, and we hope that the Tories will be responsive to good ideas. I think we've given up on the rest.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm Lucy Dunn, and today I'm joined by Tim Shipman and James Orr, Associate Professor at the University of Cambridge and Chairman of the Centre for a Better Britain think tank. This morning, Reform hosted its third press conference in as many weeks on Lawless Britain, its crime crackdown campaign that it's having over a 6-week period. Tim, you were actually there this morning. There was an announcement about its latest defector. Can you tell us who this was and what the significance of this move is?
Yeah, so this is Rupert Matthews, who's the Tory Police and Crime Commissioner for Leicestershire. He's jumped ship. I think that means it's Reform's first PCC. So they're on the board there and clocking up the defections, which are coming, pretty much weekly at the moment from the Conservative Party. Trying to keep their momentum going, and then talking, more about what they call Lawless Britain, which is a campaign that, is doing quite well. I think it's quite a coherent thing. They're making some interesting announcements, and also on the panel today, and who is joining their sort of policy group on crime and disorder is Vanessa Frake, who was a former prison governor. She was in charge of looking after people like Rose West. She was the security officer at Wormwood Scrubs, with cleaned up D-Wing there, which was, by her own description, the worst of the worst. A place with a massive drugs problem and all the rest of it. And she was talking about sort of a pretty tough regime. She talked about supermax wings in British prisons, perhaps not supermax prisons, which are very expensive, but she said there's no reason why we couldn't have supermax wings made pretty quickly. And, Farage's message in general was that, we've got to get tough on this sort of thing. And obviously he was asked again about migration, and he said, everyone who arrives illegally will be sent elsewhere. And predicting that means that within a fortnight the boats would stop coming, because if people think that they're not going to be able to stay, the boats will stop altogether. So that was what he was talking about. He also had there George Finch, who's the Reform leader of Warwickshire County Council, talking about the incident in Nuneaton that was reported over the weekend, where a couple of illegal migrants seem to have been involved in the rape of a young girl. And Finch was talking about how difficult he had found it to get the information about the immigration status of those that were accused of this crime, and the run-ins he'd had with the local police and with the chief executive of the council. He didn't find out for 2 days what had happened, and even then, by his own admission, he had to sort of phone up and beg and scream down the phone to try and get the information. And Farage was very strong that, post Southport last year, that we can't have this situation where the public isn't told, the basic facts of these situations. He said, we're constantly being threatened with contempt of court, but it's not a contempt of court to know basic information about who we're dealing with. So it was another sort of high-profile press conference which produced several news lines, and I think, what is otherwise a quiet-ish political week, that they'll get quite a lot of coverage for all of that.
And George Finch is the 19-year-old councillor, isn't it? So one of Reform's younger
That's right.
members. Uh-huh.
And Warwickshire's interesting. It's one of those places where the sort of elected Reform representatives have clashed with the kind of permanent civil service kind of, chief executive and other officials of the council. In Kent and other places, it's been slightly less confrontational. But, when people ask what it might be like if Reform were to be in charge and how would the sort of Whitehall civil service deal with it, there's maybe, this is what makes Warwickshire quite an interesting test case, because there you have what appear to be sort of permanent officials who don't really want to work closely with the elected council leader. And this incident seems to be another flashpoint in that relationship. So it's one to keep a close eye on.
James, I'm interested in your work with Centre for a Better Britain. How much influence does the think tank have over Reform policy, and how many conversations have you been having with Nigel Farage?
Well, the Centre for Better Britain is an independent think tank, and we focus on all areas of public policy, and we're not simply serving up policy to Reform, but I think when we look at Reform and we see that it really is asking this question of every policy: is it in the national preference? Can we refract this policy through something that makes sense for the nation, makes sense for improving the nation and achieving a better Britain? Now, I don't doubt that as and when we know a little bit more about the Tory party's direction over the next year or two and the sort of the policy commission's report back, that we will want to help them too and serve up some ideas and help them work through their own policy platform. But for now, I think, despite, even though there are some very interesting figures within the Tory party, who I think really do, they're not the no nation Tories, sorry, the one nation Tories, but they are better Britain Tories, and we'd want to support them as well. So, we're open to both parties, and we're seeking a politics of national preference. And I think we hope that Nigel and the leadership of Reform will be responsive to good ideas, and we hope that the Tories will be responsive to good ideas. I think we've given up on the rest.
And Tim, you mentioned that we're in recess and Farage's conferences are causing a number of news lines during a relatively quiet period in the summer. I mean, how do you think that this sort of image of wasteland Britain is cutting through, and how does it compare to what the Tories and Labour have been able to say about that as well?
Well, look, I think all the main parties agree that things are not quite right in Britain. Labour's diagnosis would be that a lot of that is down to 14 years of Conservative government, and they would claim that they have made some advances. I think it's fair to question that in terms of the economics, and in some areas I think a lot of voters would think we've gone a bit backwards. The Conservative Party is still shackled with the legacy of being in power for so long, and some in the party question whether the current leader is the right person to try and break through all that. But, Kemi Badenoch has bought herself a bit of time, and I think everyone will be looking to see what she has to say at the party conference in the autumn to decide whether they think she's worth trying to go into the local elections and beyond with her in charge. But I don't think anybody is claiming that things are wine and roses at the moment. The question is then, what do you do about it? And I think the critique of Keir Starmer and the Downing Street operation would be that, they were criticising Rishi Sunak when he was Prime Minister, probably legitimately, for being a sort of incrementalist who just wanted to turn up and sort of deliver things in a kind of low-key professional fashion. And Starmer has tried to emulate that stylistically, and I think there's a lot of people in and around Whitehall, and certainly in the public at large, who think something more radical is needed. And the way Nigel Farage is talking at the moment, he's offering at least the hope that that a reform administration would be prepared to be more radical. Now, I think he'd be, if not the first, probably the second or third to admit that policy programme is not worked out yet. When he was asked detailed questions today about his crime policy, he'd say, well, we're only just getting started. We're announcing the people who are going to be on our panel, and I'm sure he'll be keen to talk to James and his colleagues in due course about what they've come up with. And he knows he's going to need to have some kind of platform that's a little bit more worked out than what he's got at the moment. But at the moment, he's doing very well in the polls by stating, what seems sort of common sense and obvious to a lot of voters, that, the police aren't arresting enough criminals, that disorder on the streets is a problem. And, of course, as ever, Farage is weaponising the migration issue. But, that used to be a niche issue and was easily ignored by, well, it perhaps shouldn't have been ignored, but the main parties found it sort of easy to sort of paint that as a marginal pursuit. The world has changed. Across Europe, even left-of-centre governments are acknowledging that they've got to have a more coherent and sensible policy on migration. And Farage is frankly pushing an open door with the public by talking tough on this issue. I think you've got senior people in the Conservative Party. We all expect Kemi Badenoch to say we're going to, a Tory government in the future will withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. There are some Conservatives who would like us to withdraw from the Refugee Convention as well. And even in the Labour Party, there are people who are sympathetic to Keir Starmer but think that he needs to be tougher. And unless, as a human rights lawyer, he says this whole human rights architecture we've now got is not working in terms of migration, then he's going to have a job winning the next election. So what political geeks call the Overton window, that kind of area of politics that is deemed sort of acceptable and normal by the public, has moved far to the right of where it was, even 2 or 3 years ago, I think. And, Farage is now very much in the mainstream on this and is making hay with it.
Absolutely. And talking about other governments, sort of slight pivot, US Vice President JD Vance is visiting the UK this week. James, you're a friend of JD Vance's. Can you tell us, first of all, what he's like and why he's chosen the Cotswolds to holiday in?
Well, he's a very nice guy. I get on very, very well with him, and what you see is what you get. And there's an authenticity there, a kind of very, very little difference between how he is in private and how he is in public. I think he shares that quality with Trump, and I think he actually shares it with Farage too. He's coming over to England. He's going to be in England. He's going to be in Britain. He's going to be traveling around. It's a family holiday. Very few professional commitments. He doesn't want it. He's not doing much media, as I understand it. He likes coming over, and I think it's useful to be reminded that he really, for all of the press criticism of him after this speech he gave, that brilliant speech he gave in Munich a few months ago, he does not hate Europe. He doesn't hate Britain. He loves spending time here. He's especially like spending time in Britain. Usha does too. She was here in Cambridge actually for a year. Did her masters here for a year about 15 years ago, and I think we overlapped. And so yes, it's a place they love to be, and it'll be. I think it's good for us. I mean, when we're with Tim talking about the sort of the disorder, the sort of sense of chaos on the streets, and that Britain's becoming the kind of the sick man of Europe once again, is wonderful. That sort of half the American elites seem to be sort of decamping to Britain to have I don't know, to have a sort of a seat on the sidelines and watch the show.
What do we know about Vance's relationship with Nigel Farage, if there is one, and what do we know about what Vance thinks about the British right of politics?
I think the Vice President has known Nigel for many, many years. They met a long time ago, and I think they're on very good terms. He is the Vice President, so he is. That is to say, there are all sorts of diplomatic protocols and conventions and niceties, and I know that he'll be seeing the Foreign Secretary, and I don't doubt he'll be meeting the Prime Minister as well. But I'm sure he'll find time to see old friends. I'd say he follows British politics with a kind of in a very, very granular way. I'm always taken aback at how little I can actually inform him about when he asks me about what's going on. He follows things very, very closely, as he does, in fact, with European politics too. He's got a very sort of fine sense. I think which is quite unusual for American politicians. That America is an immensely complex place, complex political landscape, and they've got enough. They've normally got enough on their minds just tracking what's going on over there. So, no, he is sort of following the twists and turns of the British right, and with close interest.
Tim, I suppose it was interesting having seen Donald Trump visit the UK last week, and he was on quite friendly terms with Starmer. As James mentioned, Vance has been a little more critical of Europe and also Britain, and talking about freedom of speech. If Farage and Vance were to, as some speculation abounds this week, meet and maybe become closer, is that causing trouble down the line for Keir Starmer, do you think?
Well, as James says, there are diplomatic niceties, and I'm sure if the Vice President had that meeting, he would probably try to make it not into a diplomatic incident because he is here on holiday. But, I don't think what he said about freedom of speech is particularly unusual. I mean, the cover of the Spectator last week was making similar points about the government's bill that's supposed to protect children, but actually is having knock-on effects for freedom of speech. Farage was asked about that at the press conference this morning, and lent into that as well. He was also asked whether JD Vance backs his crime policies, and Farage went, I can't remember, which got some sarcastic laughter from the back of the room from myself, among others. But it was a sort of way of dancing around the issue. But, I think the vice president is renowned as a proper thinker about politics and where things going, and there are a number of parallels between our two countries. So the interesting thing as well is that Vance was amongst the people that David Lammy tried to ingratiate himself with. If you go back to the early part of 2024, the Foreign Secretary had kind of concluded that Trump was likely to win the election, and they made a serious effort to get alongside quite a few of the Trump people, but Vance was the most significant and important of those. I don't know what their relationship's like now, but Lammy has certainly made an effort to have a good relationship with Vance, and it's I think on both sides. You saw what Trump did at his press conference last week. He clearly is politically closer to Farage in terms of what he thinks, but he's also been polite about Starmer. He says they're friends, even though the chap is a liberal. And actually, while there was a bit of unsolicited advice about migration and taxation in that Trump press conference, it was absolutely nothing compared with the kind of stuff that Trump said when Theresa May was Prime Minister, with whom he did not have a good relationship. And he was, I think, going out of his way to try and, whilst not pull his punches on what he thinks, to try and be polite about it. And I would imagine that the Vice President will take the same approach.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, James. And thank you for listening.